Exodus. We've been on a bit of an Old Testament theme here lately. So we are looking at Moses. Now, this is probably not the Moses story that you were expecting, because we're going to kind of skip over the famous parts and look at something that we don't talk about as much about Moses. So I'm going to ask you, probably most of you already know the answer, but have you ever been through a time in your life that was frustrating, difficult, confusing? I'm going to say probably most of us have. Sometimes God allows those things, doesn't always cause them, but sometimes God allows things to happen in our lives, or things happen without God doing it, and God uses those things in order to teach us and lead us where God wants us in life. Sometimes He has to shift us from where we are to where He wants us to be. So sometimes, in order to get to where God is calling you, you have to go through a wilderness experience. Moses went through a wilderness experience, two actually, but we're going to focus on the first one today. And as you're reading the Bible, you'll probably notice many of the great leaders in the Bible went through a wilderness experience, often literally being in the wilderness. So this is from Exodus chapter 2. We're not going to go verse by verse, but we're just going to kind of go through the story. But if you want to follow along, we're in Exodus chapter 2. The story of Moses is one of those Sunday school stories that has made its way into popular culture, right? We've got movies about Moses. We've got Sunday school stories. We have books written about Moses. Even if you don't go to church, or even if you haven't been to church much, you've probably heard of Moses at some point. He's one of the best known characters in the Bible. So just to recap the short version of his upbringing, Pharaoh has decided the Israelites are too populated, and he decides to reduce the population by murdering the male babies. Pretty harsh and terrible. Moses is placed in a basket by his mother and floated down the Nile River to try and save him. He's floating down the river, and the daughter of the Pharaoh, the princess of Egypt, finds him, brings him out, saves him, adopts him, and raises Moses as her own son. So here is Moses raised as an Egyptian prince in the household of the Pharaoh. That's the short version of his upbringing. And we know from the story, he grows up knowing about his background. He knows that he's Hebrew. He knows that he's adopted. He knows that he's not Egyptian, even though he's been raised as an Egyptian. And even at a young age, he begins to identify with his people, his birth people, the Hebrews. And one day as he's out, he observes an Egyptian guard beating a Hebrew slave. And Moses identifies with the slave who is being beaten, his relative, distant perhaps, and he intervenes and ends up killing the Egyptian guard. Now, this caused Moses problems on a couple of different levels. The first was that murder is wrong. Murder is always wrong. There's never a justification for murder from what we understand in the Bible. And by murdering this guard, Moses upset the whole social order of Egypt, because the Egyptians were superior to the Israelites, they believed, because the Israelites were slaves. So to kill a guard of someone who was watching over slaves was just something you couldn't do, right? Especially as the prince. Imagine the political and social consequences of completely upending the accepted order of things. The second thing is that the Israelites actually didn't accept Moses as their leader at that time. The next day or sometime later, we see their two Hebrews are in an argument. Moses intervenes again, and they're like, what, are you going to kill us just like you did the guard? So he's been rejected by his people, and now he realizes word is out about what has happened to the guard. He hasn't concealed his crime. or not well enough. Someone has observed it. And Pharaoh finds out, and Pharaoh plans to kill Moses because of what he's done. He had upset the order too much. So Moses flees. He has to leave the country. He gets out of town and goes to the desert. So despite going about things the wrong way initially, jumping ahead into Hebrews, we see that Moses at this point had already made a decision to follow God. Now this is key for what happens next. Hebrews 11:24-25 tells us, by faith Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. So at this point, Moses has now learned rather harshly that he can't save the Israelite people on his own. Though he was probably trying to, he already probably had a sense of what God was calling him to do, but he went about it the wrong way initially. And now he's learned he can't save the Israelites by himself. He can't save them through the power of his position or his prestige as an Egyptian prince. Now he's in the desert, a murderous fugitive fleeing. He's alone. So as we continue in the story, he winds up in the country of Midian, and there he encounters the 7 daughters of Reuel. Some local shepherds are causing the daughters trouble. Now, to understand this, we have to understand in those days, women were seen to be socially inferior to men, so to have a bunch of women out in the desert alone would have been potentially inviting trouble in those days. And these local shepherds are harassing them, driving their flocks away. They might have even done things like waited for the women to pour all the water for the sheep and then come in, elbowed them out of the way, and use the water for their own flocks. And then they would have to go and fill the troughs again by themselves to water their own flocks. So this may have been, there's some sort of bullying going on here. And again, Moses steps in. He intervenes. We're starting to see a pattern here. He protects these women who are being harassed by these local shepherds. And not only does he help them, but he waters their flocks for them. Now again, to understand this, again, at this time, because women were considered socially inferior, it would have been considered improper for a man to serve the women by helping them water their own flocks. Socially, at that time, it would have been something that just wasn't done. So here's Moses, and again, you have to remember Moses' background. He was raised as a prince. He comes from the height of privilege. He had servants. Now here he is out in the desert serving others, even where it would not have been considered socially acceptable at the time to do so. And we see, for the first time, Moses was acting like a deliverer. He went about things the right way this time. And after rescuing the girls, he came to their aid. And this would have been astonishing because in ancient times, it was unthinkable for a man to perform such a menial task for women. So from the heights of privilege to serving others who, in his upbringing, would have been serving him, Moses is beginning to understand God's calling on his life. And he's beginning to show the development of character that he's going to need later on. So after showing the girls kindness, they report this to their father, and he's like, "And you didn't invite him to come over?" So he goes back, they get Moses, invite them over, and things work out okay because he ends up marrying one of the daughters. They have a family, and Moses takes up residence in the desert. And we know from the Bible that he ends up spending 40 years in the desert, living, tending sheep, and living in the desert. Now imagine this. We probably all have some sort of idea of fantasizing about being a prince or some rich person or something like that, right? We have these dreams. What would it be like? That was Moses' life. He was that person. He was the person that other people wanted to be growing up in the Egyptian palace. He had wealth. He had servants. He had the best education that money could offer at the time. He lived in one of the richest and most powerful kingdoms on earth at that time. He had everything. He told people what to do, and they did it. Now, going from that to being a fugitive, living in the desert, must have felt, I'm thinking, like a pretty big career setback, right? This is probably not the career trajectory you would imagine. You've got it all, now nothing. Here's Moses in the desert. Now, in today's world, we often assume, as we're training leaders, that you just need a great education, you need to read the right books, you need access to the right leaders, maybe someone who's been there to help you out and give you a few tips, and after that, you're ready to launch. Moses had all of that, but God wasn't done with him. God wasn't ready to launch him yet. Because as we read the Bible, often the wilderness is a place of preparation for the leader that God wants to create. Usually, the best education, the best upbringing, all the talent and skill in the world isn't enough for what God is doing. There's usually more involved. Moses learns some crucial lessons in the wilderness that he couldn't have learned in the palace. So in summary, here's a few of those lessons. In the wilderness, Moses learns to rely on God. Because in the palace, he had a lot of things he could rely on. He could rely on his position. He's a prince. He can do whatever he wants. He has the power of the empire at his back. In the palace, he could rely on money. He had as much money as he wanted to. In the palace, he could rely on prestige. Famous people in the land, well, he was one of them. He had a lot of things that he could rely on in the palace. In the wilderness, there was nothing he could rely on. He didn't have any of those things. They had all been stripped away. So in the wilderness, Moses had to learn to rely on God and God alone. That was the only thing he could rely on in the wilderness. Secondly, as a number of biblical leaders do, Moses spent time as a shepherd. And as a shepherd, he learned some more lessons that he was going to need later on in life. Now, I've seen sheep and touched them, but I don't know a ton about sheep. But there's a pretty persistent rumor that sheep are not very intelligent. The Bible compares people to sheep, so, put that together and see what you think of that. But apparently sheep are not that intelligent. They need a lot of care. They need to be led to water. They need to be led to safe places to eat. They need guidance. They need constant care. They need to be protected from predators. So as Moses spent years as a shepherd, he learned the lessons that he was going to need later to lead the sheep of Israel out of Egypt into the wilderness. He learned to take care of them. He learned to guide them. He learned to find water in the wilderness, the paths to take, how to navigate, all of these things he learned as a shepherd in the wilderness. And it was by tending his flock that Moses learned how to feed, defend, and rescue the lost sheep of Israel. And I don't know that Moses was necessarily too excited about spending 40 years in the desert as a shepherd, but these lessons that he learned would become crucial for his calling later in life. And this is the thing. Moses' education, which was world class at the time, and his status and privilege in the palace weren't enough for the kind of leader that God was forming. And it's often in hard or difficult situations that our character is revealed, reformed, and refined. And that's what God used the wilderness experience for in Moses' life, to refine, reveal, and reform his character. So we've seen the growth and wilderness years of Moses, and just as a little aside, I was thinking about this. When we study the great leaders and characters of the Bible, I think we tend to, at least I do, maybe you don't, but we tend to see them in their finished form. We see them at the height of their influence, right? You think about the Apostle Paul, and yeah, you understand, he kind of had this murderous background and that, but he became Paul, right? The Apostle Paul, the amazing missionary, the great leader of the early church. We see Moses, leader of the Israelites, leader of millions of people going through the desert, getting them to the promised land. We see David, king, leading the nation, most successful and, best king that Israel ever had. We see Peter leading the early church. But all of these leaders, I think sometimes we forget about the wilderness experience because they all had it. They all went through a wilderness experience. We see them in their finished form often. We view them through that lens, what God called them to in their great tasks and accomplishments at that time. But the thing is, they didn't just appear ready to take on what God had called them to. It took time. Even Jesus went through years of preparation and his own wilderness experience. And we forget, I think, in our own lives that we don't, just pop out ready to perform, right? We have to grow. We learn. We have experiences. We go through education. We go through wilderness experiences. We make mistakes. We learn from them. We carry on, and God leads us and guides us. But I think the thing we forget is that just as in the Bible, all of these leaders were a work in progress. From the moment they were born, God was leading them, guiding them, directing them. And for our own lives, it's the same. We, each of us, are a work in progress. If you're alive here today, which I hope all of you are, God is not finished with you. You are a work in progress. God is still teaching you. He's leading you. He's growing you. The experiences that you have, God will use them to help you and to grow you into the person that he has called you to be, to reveal and refine character. And the amazing thing, again, when we go back to the formative years of these great leaders, almost all of them made massive mistakes. Moses, Paul, David were all murderers. And we think, that's not usually the type of leaders you would pick. Like nowadays, they wouldn't pass a background check to be a pastor, right? They wouldn't even be able to volunteer, greeting people at the door. They wouldn't pass the criminal record check. But God can use even flawed people to accomplish what he has called them to. And people are able to learn and to grow and to mature. And Moses' personal 40-year sojourn in the wilderness prepared him to lead God's people through their own 40-year wilderness experience. So applying to our own lives here this morning, just as he did with Moses, God often prepares people through a wilderness experience. Now, in the Bible, that was often literally a wilderness experience. For us, it may not be literally spending 40 days or 40 years in the wilderness, but it may nonetheless be a wilderness experience of some kind. You may find yourself in a situation that doesn't seem or feel ideal, just like Moses going from the palace to the desert. It doesn't seem ideal. That's not, the career trajectory that most of us would map out. You usually think it's the other way around, right? The wilderness to the palace. But for Moses, it was the other way. But that's what God had planned for him. God leads and prepares people. He leads and prepares you where you are. And he uses the lessons that are happening where you are. So I'll ask, what lessons can you take from your current situation, whatever it is? I don't know exactly where each and every person here is at, those who are joining us online, but whatever your experiences are right now, what lessons can you take from those experiences? And secondly, related to that, what do you think God is trying to teach you in the experiences that you're having right now. Again, don't get me wrong, God is not out to get you. God often doesn't cause the things that happen to us, but just because something happens to us that is negative or we view as negative or wrong, can be wrong, but God can still use that in order to grow us as people. So what lessons might God be teaching you in the circumstances that you find yourself in right now? It's often in the wilderness, just like Moses, that we come to trust and rely on God. Because in the wilderness, we don't have anything else. We don't have money, we don't have power, we don't have prestige. There's just you and God. And so the choices rely on yourself. That doesn't usually seem to work out too well, or rely on God. And it's in the wilderness we often come to learn to rely on God and to trust in Him. So what lessons, thinking back in your own life, what lessons have you learned in difficult circumstances or situations in your life that you wouldn't have learned without going through the difficult circumstances? It's often not pleasant at the time, but you can probably think of something, a lesson you learned in the past that you wouldn't have learned if you hadn't gone through a difficult experience. And there's a saying that life is lived forward, but understood backwards, meaning we don't often understand what's happening right now. It's only later, as we look back with the benefit of hindsight, that we understand what was happening at that time in our lives. Then we can see what the lessons were, what God was doing in our lives at that time. Moses probably didn't know exactly what was going on at this time, this wilderness experience, but I'm sure looking back later in his life, he was probably thankful for that wilderness experience, because 40 years in the wilderness by himself prepared him to lead the nation through 40 years in the wilderness. And finally, hold out hope, because the wilderness experience does end. It's not forever. It's a season. It's a time. For Moses, it was 40 years. It was about a third of his life. It's a long time, but still, it wasn't his whole life. And it ended, and he went on to lead the people out of Egypt to the calling that God had for him. So wherever you are, maybe you're in a wilderness experience right now, today. Maybe you're not, but you've probably had a wilderness experience at some point. And remember, God is with you. He's leading you. He's teaching you. And He has a good plan for your life. God is with you in the wilderness. He will not leave you, and He will not forsake you.